Alrighty, friends, we are continuing our discussion about motivation, and we are at the part where we got to talk about sex. Yay, or boo, or weird, whatever. It's worth exploring how exactly sex motivates us, right? If you think of sort of the basic things that motivate us, um, sex is different than some of the others because the others seem to be directly related to survival. and while and while when you're a teenager it may feel like you're going to die if you don't have sex, you won't. Um, the fact of the matter is that there are biological motivations, and I mean the entire field of evolutionary psychology spends quite a bit of time digging into this. Um, that we are interested in preserving not only our own life and our own safety, but we have a vested interest in passing on our own genetic material. And so reproduction is the primary way to do that, and really the only way to do that. And so as a result, it does motivate us, right? Now, when we talk about sexual desire and what exactly that motivation is, we've got to recognize that it's actually pretty complex. I'm sure that you are aware at this point that our hormones, or at least some of them, influence our level of sexual desire. However, this works differently in humans than it does in most other mammals. Pretty much all other mammals, um, the females go into heat, or go through estrus is the specific term for it, where they are only sexually receptive during a very short period. As someone who is in a house where people are doing dog breeding all of the time, or I guess the dogs are doing the breeding. Let me rephrase that. Um, I see this going on all of the time, right? So if a male dog tries to mount a female dog and she is not in the right stage of heat, which she only experiences as dogs only go through heat about once every 6 months. Different species will have different sort of spacing in terms of their heat cycles. But so yeah, if the female dog is not in the correct stage of heat, she'll snap at the male and won't allow him to mount her. Um, Humans do this differently, right? While while females do have ovulatory cycles, of course, monthly cycles in which you actually release your egg from from the ovaries, and then are fertile and can reproduce. Sexual activity can happen at any time, whether you are ovulating or not. And so our sexual activity and our sexual desire is not nearly as bound up by the biological hormonal um, factors to the same extent that is true for most other mammals. Now, when we're talking about what hormones are active, obviously we're talking about the sex hormones here, but while you might think that it's testosterone that's primarily responsible for sexual desire in men and estrogen in women, that it is actually not true. It appears that higher levels of testosterone are associated with higher levels of sexual desires for both males and females. Um, and so that seems to be the primary driver hormonally, is testosterone. Now, um, we do have, feedback systems in our body as well. Particular parts of the body, the genitals obviously, but other erogenous zones in the body that do spark sexual desire as well. So stimulation of those parts of the body obviously is going to arouse sexual desire. Um, but you don't even necessarily have to have that going on either, right? Just thinking about someone or about sexual thoughts can stimulate sexual desire as well, in humans, which seems to be pretty unique to the human species. Um, Granted, we don't really know a ton about the thought processes of other species simply because we can't communicate with them. But it seems that our cognitions And I mean, probably everybody that's listening to this recognizes that sensation, right? Of just thinking through, just having your thoughts randomly going and going, that's not a bad idea right now. At any rate, you get what I'm saying. It's not just hormonal status or stimulation of the body, but even just thoughts can stimulate sexual desire. And it's worth recognizing that what thoughts stimulate sexual desire is going to be constrained or at least informed by the culture that you live in. All right. Now, this may be a little bit less obvious, but if you think about it, there have been times and places in the history of this nation and plenty of others where the sight of somebody's ankle would be considered erotic, right? Because during that time, the social norms were that you covered your legs, right? And so somebody seeing your ankle would be like, "Whoa, that's a little scandalous. I'm not sure if I can deal with that." Now, I don't know about the rest of yous, but I could look at ankles all day long, and it's not going to move the needle at all. So that sort of goes to show you that um, sexual desire in terms of how we think about sex and the availability of sex and whether or not someone is signaling to us that they are an available sexual partner is constrained by the culture that we live in, right? How somebody dresses, how they speak to you, how they touch you. All of this is going to be culturally determined. And so you got to be really careful when you go someplace else because the cues are likely to be different, at least in some subtle and in some cases quite obvious ways, because we agree on all of this stuff together, even though we don't necessarily all sit down together and talk about it. It's communicated to us through all of the actions that we receive through the people that we interact with and through the media that we consume. So all of this comes together to influence our sexual desire and get us going, so to speak, motivate us to reproduce. Now, hopefully you know by now, there is variability in whom whatever who people find sexually attractive, right? Who they want to mate with, who they want to experience those sort of romantic feelings for. Um, the majority of individuals identifies as heterosexual, meaning that they are sexually attracted to the opposite sex. Um, However, as our society has tried to grapple with some of the issues around homosexuality and what that means, and is this okay? Is this not okay? And how do we feel about this? More and more research has been done to figure out what exactly is sexual attraction and why do some people experience it differently than most. Because you do have folks who identify as homosexual, meaning that they are attracted to the same sex that they are. Um, Folks who are bisexual, or we've got an increasingly broad number of terms to try to be more inclusive. And it's worth recognizing as well that for a growing section of the population, treating gender and gender attraction as a binary is insufficiently complex for the reality that exists. And the fact of the matter is that you do have folks who either I want to be really careful here because gender identity is not necessarily the same um, as sexual orientation, right? Those are independent things, but they do interact with each other, especially in terms of how we talk about it. But you can have folks who either are themselves non-binary, and so what does that mean for them to be attracted to someone of the opposite gender, right? If you're not on a binary, then there's no such thing as an opposite, and so then how do you define that, and what do you call that? We're still working on that, right? And I imagine that is a conversation that will continue to evolve over the next generation or more as we uh, as a society, determine exactly how inclusive we are trying to be and want to be, and who we're allowing to sort of tell the stories about sexuality, right? Okay, now going along with this, if you want to look at the beginning of research into sexuality of any sort, you got to look back at Albert Kinsey. Alfred? Albert. Crap. I think it's Albert. Doesn't matter. Kinsey. He was doing his work in the 50s and 60s, and if you think back to the history in the United States at that time, you didn't talk about sex. That was totally unacceptable in polite society. And he was the first one, well, not the first one, but one of the first ones to successfully say, hey, this is really something we should be researching so that we really know what's going on. And so he initiated research into uh, folks' sort of unvarnished responses on sexuality, where he was asking a broader set of questions and focusing just on sexuality rather than sort of shoving it off into a corner. And what he found really sort of shocked folks um, in terms of the variety of sexual activity and sexual orientation that people reported in what was then considered to be polite, conservative American culture. Um, Now, the numbers or the percentages continue to be difficult to nail down exactly in terms of what are our percentages of straight folks versus gay folks versus bisexual folks. Um, you get, depending on the research, you get anywhere between 2 and 10% of individuals who identify as homosexual or bisexual. Um, However, even the top end of that number may not necessarily be entirely accurate, simply because, despite the fact that we're more open to talking about these things now than we might have been a generation ago or 2 generations ago, nevertheless, still it's hard to get honest answers out of gay folks and bi folks under certain circumstances, right? Because you've got a lot of these folks who are either still developing their own sense of sexual identity or are not necessarily comfortable telling a stranger about it, even under circumstances of anonymity. And there are plenty of reasons why non straight folks might not feel comfortable sharing that information about themselves because historically that is not a safe thing to do. At any rate, we're still not exactly sure of those numbers. Best estimates are somewhere between 2 and 10%. That's a pretty wide range. But if one of the interesting things that Kinsey came up with or revealed about sexual attraction was that it's not necessarily a binary between homosexual and heterosexual, but rather a continuum in which you have some folks who are exclusively heterosexual in their desire, some folks who are exclusively homosexual in their desire, but then there are stopping points everywhere between those two endpoints where you've got some folks who are primarily heterosexual, but then have a small amount of homosexual desire, or those who experience an even split. Or an uneven split, right? It can be like you can see, you've got a 0 to 6 scale here, and you could probably subdivide that even further um, in order to cover everybody's sort of where they really fall. Um, there have been other researchers since who have said, well, this is true and this is interesting, but at the same time, there's more to it than just that. We could add another dimension. So if this continuum is going from left to right, we could add another one from up, going from up to down, right? So we're on a quadrant system now, with the other continuum being highly sexually motivated to asexual, right? And increasingly, this is once again something that we pay more attention to in our society, where there's folks who are like, yeah, we spend a lot of time focused on romance and sex in our society, and I'm just not having it. Not interested, thanks very much. And so that's someone who would be more towards the asexual side of things, right? And then you've got other folks who that's, really all they can think about until they're about 40 years old. And that would be someone who is, more on the highly sexually motivated end of things. But that then allows you to be, and I mean, you can be anywhere on the scale, right? You can be mostly asexual and highly heterosexual, highly homosexual, right? And so that's someone who is perhaps romantically interested in one or the other sex or in both, but is not necessarily interested in engaging in sexual activity. Or someone, yeah, I mean, think of, you don't draw out those four quadrants for yourself, and you could probably locate with a relative degree of specificity where you yourself fall on that quadrant system. Okay, I think that's all I wanted to say about that. Let's talk about emotion, right? Once again, we're talking about motivation. There is no conversation about motivation that's complete without talking about emotion, because especially in the cultural narratives that we create for ourselves in Western society, emotion is motivation. I do this because I feel like it. Well, then we got to talk about our feelings, right? So we're going to talk a little bit about what's going on biologically, and then we're going to cover some different theories of emotion and different expressions of emotion. When you're talking about what sections of the brain are active in the processing of emotion, we've talked a little bit already about the amygdala. That is one of the primary centers to talk about. Not that that covers all emotion, but it is very important for fear and anger, right? So the amygdala is in a closely connected circuit of brain matter. When I say circuit, we're neurons that are connected to each other, right? The amygdala and the insula are both connected to the cingulate cortex and basal ganglia. Those are also connected then to the cerebral cortex on the surface of the brain, and each of them have sort of different jobs in terms of what they are doing in the processing of emotion. So the amygdala is processing incoming stimuli, everything that you see and that you hear, for things that we should be scared of or angry about, right? The insula is identifying other emotional stimuli, not necessarily related to fear or anger, so things that make us happy, things that make us sad. The cingulate cortex appears to be related to the pain aspect of emotion. It's interesting. We don't often think of it this way, but emotion can cause you pain, and at a certain level, it is actually very similar to physical pain. So, not to get too personal, but my oldest brother passed away just a few weeks ago, and in talking to my mom since then, um, she says, it's just I'm experiencing pain as a part of my grief in a way that I just never have before. I actually physically hurt. Neuroscience research backs her up on this. The cingulate cortex processes both physical pain and emotional pain in very similar ways and in the same part of the brain, right? One thing that is actually interesting, there's been some research that's been done that shows that the pain of social isolation is actually processed in the same part of the brain as physical pain. And not only that, but when they give people acetaminophen, which is Tylenol, before experiencing social isolation, they actually experience less of it. In the same way that Tylenol dulls your physical pain, it also dulls your emotional pain. So, if you know you're going to a party where it's going to be rough, take a few Tylenol first, and that will take the edge off of that emotional pain of sitting in the corner and wishing you were like everybody else. I may have just told you too much about myself. At any rate, that's the cingulate cortex is important for that. Basal ganglia is more associated with the reward aspect of emotion, positive emotion, and sort of rush that gives you. And then the cerebral cortex appears to be related to identifying behavioral responses to emotion, right? And not more than just that, identifying exactly um, what the emotion is and how we should cognitively and physically respond to that. Okay, so all of those parts of the brain are dealing with emotion, right? Now let's talk about some of the different theories of emotion, starting at some of the earliest and coming towards some more current ones. One of the first theories of emotion was the James Lange theory of emotion. You'll notice all of these theories have two names attached to them. For some reason, with our theories of emotion, these first three, all of them had two different researchers attached. And in some cases, like with James and Lange, we're talking about William James here, who was one of our first like sort of big deal psychologists. He was working on this work independently at the same time over in the Netherlands, I want to say, or on the other side of the ocean. Lange was working on the same topic, and so both of their names got attached to the theory. At any rate, what these gentlemen said was that we actually um, think about emotion incorrectly in sort of the narrative that we tell ourselves. Because generally, what we think is that we experience the emotion, I am sad, and then you have the physical response. Because I am sad, I begin to cry, right? James and Lange both said, no, no, no. You have a stimulus that elicits that will eventually elicit some emotion. What you get is the the physical response coming first, and then based on the physical response that we're having, we assign an emotion to that. So because I am crying, I know I am sad, right? That would be the James Lange approach to emotion. And what they both said is that different emotional states have distinct physical responses. And so all we have to do is sort of monitor our own body, and then we will know how we are feeling, right? So the sort of classic test case that they talked about was having some sort of dangerous stimulus walk into the room. A bear comes into the room where I am. Now, my sort of everyday thinking about emotion is I see the bear, I feel scared, and then my heart rate speeds up and I get ready to run. James and Lange said, no, you got it backwards. You see the bear, your body automatically responds with fight or flight stimulus or response, right? Your sympathetic nervous system ramps up to get you ready to roll. We are constantly monitoring ourselves, and when we experience that speeding up of the heart rate and the tensing in the muscles, we go, oh, I'm frightened right now. It's time to go, right? Um, all right, let's move on to the second theory. The Cannon-Bard theory was sort of a response to the James Lange theory, which says, no, no, no. The physical response and the feeling occur at the same time. They're separate systems, right? So as I am feeling the physical response to the bear walking in the room, I am at the same time going, holy crap, there's a bear. I gotta go, right? Um, and so they're sort of separate systems working on different tracks, according to Cannon-Bard. Now, Schachter-Singer then takes both of those previous theories and sort of melds them together. And what they do tend more towards the James Lange side, where they are saying, actually, no, you are just sort of monitoring your environment, your body to see how you respond, and that's how you assign emotion. But what they say is that not all emotions are physiologically distinct from each other, right? Can you tell the difference in your physiological response to, say, shame versus guilt? Those feel very similar to me. I'm not going to be able to tell those apart just based on how my body is reacting, right? So what the Schachter-Singer theory is that we experience generalized arousal in the body due to some stimulus, right? As we are experiencing this arousal, we go, hey, what's going on? Why am I feeling this way? We assess the environment and decide how we ought to feel cognitively based on how we judge our environment to be happening. So according to Schachter and Singer, I see the bear, my body freaks out just a little bit, and I go, holy cow, I'm feeling weird. What is happening? Oh, there's a bear in the room. All right, I should be scared, right? Now, there is some research support for this idea that it is a generalized arousal, and then we've got to figure out what we're feeling. There was an old classic social psychology experiment where the researchers injected their participants with adrenaline. Um, Now, half of the you couldn't ever do this these days. You wouldn't be able to get away with this, but it was the '60s. You could do this stuff. Um, Half of the individuals, they told them that it was adrenaline and said explained how they were likely to feel. We just gave you an adrenaline shot. You're likely to feel jumpy and anxious and sort of revved up, right? The other half of individuals, they told them it was a vitamin shot, right? And then, no matter what they'd been told, the individual was then released into a waiting room where they then sat for like half an hour. Now, there were other people in the room. It turns out, though, that only the one person who had received the shot was actually a participant. Everybody else was a confederate of the researcher, meaning they were in on it. They were actors. Well, in this waiting room, after a few minutes, one of the Confederates gets up and starts ranting about how long they've been waiting and how upset they are about having their time wasted. And they go on that way for 10 or 15 minutes. Eventually, the researcher comes out, hands the participant or takes them out of the room, hands the participant a questionnaire that asks them how they're feeling. What they found was that the people who were told that they were given a vitamin shot were super upset. The people who knew they had been given adrenaline were not very upset at all. Now, how does this correspond to the Schachter-Singer theory of emotion? Well, it's all about appraisal and assessment, right? All of these people, because they had been given adrenaline, were experiencing some generalized arousal in their body where they were ramped up and really feeling it, right? They then had to assess, why am I feeling this way? Now, the people who knew they had been given adrenaline said, oh, well, I'm feeling edgy because they gave me an adrenaline shot. It's not a problem. Okay, I'm fine. The people who thought they had been given a vitamin shot were feeling all edgy and antsy and like angry. And when they assessed the environment for why they were feeling this way, what did they see? Somebody who was ranting and raving about somebody wasting their time. And so they got super pissed about their time being wasted because their emotion was determined by their assessment of the situation, right? So that is one fairly well-supported theory of emotion. One that came even after that is the somatovisceral afference model of emotion. It's a big, long name that essentially takes the Schachter-Singer theory and revises it even further to say, no, hang on, there are some distinct physiological states that produce particular emotions. Those are our basic emotions, but we do have more complex emotions, and for those ones, we have to stop and think about it, right? So what this says is that if you are feeling rage, like you know what rage feels like in your body, right? And so we can identify those really quickly without even really having to think about it much. But there are more complex emotions like pride or ambivalence that take a little bit more thinking about. And once again, there is some good research support for this, where researchers I'm sorry, I'm blanking on what I was going to say. They inspired different emotions in their participants and then asked them to identify what they were feeling as quickly as they could. The people who were feeling basic emotions with strong physiological responses that are definite, things like joy or rage or fear or sadness, were able to identify their emotions really quickly. However, if the thing that was being the emotion being prompted was something more complicated, like pride, people took longer in giving their responses, meaning there was more cognition that had to happen in order to identify what exactly they were feeling. So how much assessment of the environment we have to do depends on whether it is a simple emotion or a complex emotion. Okay. All right. One of the last things I want to talk about in terms of emotion, there's been quite a lot of research done on the expression of emotion and how universal it is. Now, some of the earliest work suggested that the expression of emotion was universal across all societies. You got some folks who would go to these previously isolated cultures and would show them pictures of folks making these faces. Now, looking at these faces, you are probably able to define pretty easily what those emotions are, right? Happy, I'm going across top to bottom. Happy, angry, surprised, um, disgusted, sad, scared, right? Easy. Now, oops. Sorry about that. When they took these pictures to these previously uh, isolated cultures and asked them these same questions, then, according to the early research, they were very successful at identifying what those emotions were. However, looking back at some of that early research, there was some language barrier stuff going on and some constraining of the responses on the researchers' part that actually gave a misleading impression as to how universal all of those expressions were. It appears that there are some emotional expressions that are culturally determined, and it may not be quite as universal as we originally assumed. Um, Another difficulty with that early research was is that they were going to like these, Pacific Islands or deep in the jungles of the Amazon or wherever, and showing these people pictures of white folks, which they'd probably never seen before, right? And so more modern research has gotten more better at matching the faces, and some of that research is a little bit more nuanced and shows that there is some difference from one culture to the next in terms of emotional expression. Go anywhere else in the world and you will find that this is true, right? Um, People respond, the expression of emotions is constrained by, taught by the people around us. And so in different places, it can end up being a little bit different. However, we are very good, especially within our own culture, at identifying um, whether an emotion is real or not, right? We are all experts at human faces because we've been watching them like hawks our entire lives. And so we get really good at identifying what is a real smile versus a fake smile, right? And the reason that we're good at this is that we pay a lot of attention to the area around the eyes. A lot of the muscles that flex around the eyes are involuntary in their movement, meaning that we don't have very good control of them. And as a result, when we want to know whether or not someone is being honest in their emotional expression, we'll look at the eyes. Um, and that tends to be a pretty good indicator of whether it's a real smile or not, right? And you can look at those two pictures there and you know which one of those is, hey, I'm glad to see you. And the other one's like, oh, I tried to ghost you last weekend, right? Okay, cool. Now, just as a reminder, sort of to close us out, the reason that we talk about emotion and is that emotion does generate motivation, right? How I am feeling is going to constrain how I act and what I choose to do, what I am motivated toward. If I am angry, I am going to be motivated to respond to my children in a very different way than I am if I am happy or bored or whatever else, right? And so our emotional states serve to motivate us towards things that then either ameliorate that emotional state or continue it if it's an emotional state that we are enjoying. And so really you can't talk about why people do things unless you are talking about, at least some about, what their emotions are and how they're feeling, because how I feel is going to determine how I behave. Okay. All right, that's it for emotion for this week. We will come back to you next week with a whole different topic. All right, thanks everybody. Have a great weekend.